Imagine a world where steel and diplomacy intersect, where automotive empires clash with protectionist walls. On March 27, 2025, the world witnessed an economic challenge thrown down by the United States administration under Donald Trump, one that echoed across the globe. In the early days of his term, Donald Trump explicitly renewed his threat of tariffs against Europe, announcing a 25% duty on all passenger car and truck imports into the country. Germany, an economic titan whose automotive industry is a cornerstone of its prosperity, faced a prospect that threatened to disrupt years of trade relations. Germany, which had long skillfully maintained a delicate diplomatic balance within the European Union, suddenly realized that the 25% duty on auto imports imposed by the Trump administration was just a harbinger of things to come. Berlin sent an unambiguous signal. Underestimating Germany has consequences, and a response would not be long in coming. Notably, Germany was not alone in its outrage this time. France, in unison with its German partners, declared its readiness for a tough trade confrontation with the United States, thereby strengthening the united European position. American officials were likely beginning to realize the full seriousness of European anger. Germany, as the industrial engine of Europe and one of the world's leading exporters of automobiles and equipment, possesses significant economic weight. Escalating trade tensions could lead to an economic rift between Washington and Berlin, the likes of which have not been seen in modern history. When a senior German government official stated that nothing can be ruled out, observers immediately speculated about the possibility of taxes and restrictions on American tech giants, which would be a painful blow to U.S. economic interests. For a long time, Germany preferred to maintain a restrained position in its relations with its European partners, avoiding open tariff confrontations with the United States. However, this time Berlin made it clear that retaliatory measures would not be limited to the automotive industry. If necessary, Germany is prepared for tough action in the fields of technology, agriculture, and possibly the introduction of digital service taxes. This sounded like a decisive response to the Trump administration's warning of potentially raising tariffs, starting at 25%, if necessary. The signals coming from Berlin unequivocally hinted that Germany would not stand idly by while new American duties were imposed on steel or high-tech products. Moreover, Germany may take coordinated action in conjunction with the European Union. Thus, the protectionist standoff that began 2 years ago over the automotive industry threatens to spill over into entirely new sectors, such as electric vehicles, battery technology, and even artificial intelligence software. Germany plays a key role in the European Union, serving as its economic engine. A significant portion of EU trade is centered around German products, especially in the automotive industry, where brands such as Mercedes, BMW, Audi, and Volkswagen enjoy global popularity. Millions of these vehicles travel the roads of the United States, and German auto and parts exports to the U.S. were valued at over $35 billion by 2024. In addition to automobiles, Germany supplies the U.S. with machinery and equipment, chemical products, and high-tech devices. As one of the leading suppliers to the American automotive market, Germany faced a serious challenge when the Trump administration imposed a 25% duty. This move shook the automotive sector, causing a slowdown in sales of German cars due to rising prices. In response to this unilateral measure, the German government declared its readiness to defend its economic interests. On the morning of March 28, 2025, a representative of the German government emphasized that, if necessary, Germany could impose retaliatory duties on American cars, electronic products, and agricultural goods. Germany, as the engine of the European economy, represents a complex partner for the American administration. Joining it are other major EU players, France, Italy, and Spain, which are also considering a coordinated response to U.S. actions under the auspices of the European Commission. The head of the European Commission stated unequivocally that American duties on automobiles are a direct blow to the European economy, to which the EU already has a response prepared. Behind the scenes in European offices, it is being discussed that retaliatory measures could go beyond the automotive industry and affect American airlines or technology platforms. Such a scenario is fraught with serious imbalances in global trade. The threat of retaliation from Canada and the power of the European market create a situation where the U.S.'s trade relations with the EU and Canada, valued at $1.8 trillion, could be at risk of fragmentation. Behind the scenes in the Berlin administration, talks of a digital tax for IT corporations from the U.S. have resurfaced, immediately reviving the debate on the taxation of digital services. A few years ago, Germany and France had already attempted to introduce similar measures, but the initiative became bogged down in opposition from Washington. Now, a new approach is maturing in European political circles. If the Trump administration imposes sanctions against the European automotive, steel, and energy industries, Europe will have its hands untied in the matter of digital taxes. The implementation of such a scenario would lead to American social networks and e-commerce platforms facing additional financial burdens in the European market. However, retaliatory measures may not be limited to just that. According to some reports, Germany is considering simultaneously introducing additional tariffs on American agricultural products, reducing import quotas, or adopting regulations that would complicate the activities of American manufacturers in Europe. Such a turn of events could provoke the anger of American farmers, as the European market is of strategic importance to them. The Trump administration risks facing increasing internal pressure if the situation reaches a critical point. Germany seems determined to lead the resistance to the car tariffs imposed by Trump, demonstrating a firm unwillingness to yield. Berlin is preparing to take an uncompromising stance, not only at the level of trade departments but also at the highest political level. Thus, on March 27, 2025, the German finance minister emphasized the country's readiness to resolutely defend its national interests. He noted that, despite the fact that the U.S. remains Germany's largest trading partner, this does not imply unilateral concessions. In turn, the German economics minister warned Washington, pointing to the potentially devastating consequences of high tariffs for all global trade. Against the backdrop of these statements, it becomes obvious that Germany is ready to discard its traditional mask of diplomatic restraint. Such a step could create serious challenges not only within the framework of the negotiation process, but also in the broader context of transatlantic relations. While some of the American political establishment hopes that Trump will realize the risks and soften his position, understanding that simultaneous confrontation with the EU and Canada could have serious consequences for him, the president himself seems determined to go all the way. Analysts warn that if Germany takes on the role of locomotive of the European economy and leads the European Union, Canada may immediately introduce its own retaliatory measures, which will create tremendous pressure on the United States. According to experts, Donald Trump's trade policy threatens a colossal volume of trade operations, reaching $1.8 trillion. Disruption of supplies of German automotive equipment to the U.S. could lead to job losses for tens of thousands of people on both sides of the Atlantic. Of course, such a scenario is not in the interests of any of the parties, but political ambitions seem to take precedence over economic considerations. This is exactly what Berlin implies when it states that it does not rule out any options. If necessary, Germany is ready to bear the costs and take retaliatory measures. German automotive concerns are also actively defending their interests. In the event of increased tariffs in the American market, companies such as BMW, Mercedes, and Audi may be forced to move part of their production to the U.S. However, even in this case, new tariffs could make it difficult to purchase the necessary materials. Thus, the situation appears to be very multifaceted and complex. German business is rushing around in search of a way out of a difficult situation. On the one hand, it begs its own government not to respond too sharply to Washington's actions, so as not to aggravate the situation. On the other hand, it appeals to the Trump administration, convincing it of the injustice of the imposed duties and demanding their speedy abolition. However, in the era that has come after Angela Merkel's departure, voices are sounding louder and louder in the German political establishment that the time for concessions has passed. They say that Germany has already made enough gestures of goodwill, even risking serious losses for its automotive brands. Now, when national honor and European interests are at stake, compromise is unacceptable. This tough line is also supported by public opinion. Relations with the United States are undoubtedly important, but they shouldn't be a one-way street. That's the sentiment echoing in Berlin today. If Donald Trump has imposed a 25% tax on German cars, why not retaliate? German citizens ask in numerous interviews. However, the European picture isn't limited to Germany alone. We shouldn't forget the positions of France and Italy, for whom access to the American market in sectors like agriculture, luxury goods, and high technology is of strategic importance. If the United States introduces new duties, France would be hit hard, with its famous wines and cheeses under threat, as would Italy, where the fashion and gastronomy industries would suffer. In response, French authorities aren't ruling out retaliatory measures against American agricultural and cultural products. Germany, in turn, is signaling its readiness to act in concert with Paris, possibly within the framework of a pan-European strategy. The possibility of including measures such as digital taxes for American tech giants in this package is currently being actively discussed. It's also possible that retaliatory measures could affect American aerospace corporations like Boeing, as well as startups from Silicon Valley. Such a development could take the transatlantic crisis to a new level. If this is compounded by a reduction in energy supplies from Canada and the introduction of digital taxes in Europe, the U.S. risks finding itself in a situation of diplomatic isolation. German media are already full of headlines reflecting the determination not to yield to pressure from the American president, which indicates growing tension in relations between the allies. The authorities previously imposed duties on steel and aluminum, and this provoked a restrained reaction. However, the situation has now changed, as the automotive sector is in the crosshairs. Employees of companies such as Mercedes, BMW, Audi, and Volkswagen are expressing serious concern, stating that their businesses will suffer significant damage. Exports are decreasing, and production lines are slowing down. German trade unions are actively protesting, demanding that the government not stand aside in the event of a trade war initiated by America. Under such internal pressure, the Berlin government may be forced to take tough measures in response to the administration's actions. News headlines about Germany's possible response to Trump's tariffs reflect the real state of affairs. Outwardly calm, Germany is experiencing internal turmoil that could turn into a real storm, capable of affecting the United States as well. Germany's leadership in Europe is threatened by statements that even larger duties will be introduced if the EU and Canada unite. The prospect of seeing how far Berlin is willing to go in its confrontation, whether the European Union will remain united, and how synchronized actions will be with Canada looms on the horizon. However, judging by the increasing severity of the statements, if Washington refuses a reasonable compromise, Germany may activate the mechanism of retaliatory measures, introducing duties on both automotive products and American technology companies. Such a step could destabilize an already fragile global economy. The history of trade wars has repeatedly confirmed that there are no winners in such conflicts, but the Trump administration seems convinced that the United States, as a great power, cannot suffer defeat. In turn, Germany is demonstrating its determination to fight back, viewing the imposed duties as a manifestation of aggression requiring an adequate response. France and other European countries are likely to support any actions aimed at protecting Europe's interests. If such coordination is achieved, a significant portion of the U.S. trade flow, estimated at $1.8 trillion, could be at risk. How should we interpret the current situation? According to some analysts, the announcement of retaliatory measures by Europe and Canada, whether jointly or individually, could be an incentive for the U.S. to return to the negotiating table. There are rumors that Donald Trump is demonstrating unwavering resolve, which is fraught with a serious crisis. Germany will undoubtedly defend its automotive sector, the cornerstone of the national economy, and the European Union is unlikely to leave Berlin alone. The headline "Germany may respond to Trump's tariffs with everything it has" is not an exaggeration, but a statement of harsh reality. Berlin is ready to use its historical and economic weight to challenge the United States, to force them to take the situation seriously, otherwise retaliatory measures are inevitable. This conflict also fuels discussions about global leadership. The European Union, which has long been considered disorganized, may find a sense of unity in confronting America. It remains uncertain whether Trump will succeed in implementing a divide-and-conquer strategy by splitting the countries of the European Union. However, the strong alliance between Germany and France seems to leave little room for this. Many are wondering if American industrial, agricultural, and technological lobbies will try to influence his administration. In the event of a full-scale response from Germany, it would be extremely difficult for American companies to maintain their position in the European market, which would inevitably trigger a wave of criticism against Trump on the domestic political scene. If Canada intervenes simultaneously, there is a real threat of losing energy and parts supplies to the northern regions, as well as European automotive and technology markets, which would be a devastating double blow. Political leaders in Berlin seem to be hoping for a softening of U.S. domestic policy, but the signals that came on March 27th leave no doubt about the firmness of Trump's intentions. The president has repeatedly stated his willingness to impose significantly higher tariffs in the event of resistance. German analysts, assessing the scale of trade flows, note that both sides will suffer losses, but the American economy will be hit the hardest. The question of whether Trump is willing to take such a risk remains open. It remains to be seen whether Germany, faced with Trump's tariffs, is ready to go to extremes, or whether this is just a tactical move, an attempt to raise the stakes at the negotiating table. If Germany, as the locomotive of the European economy and an automotive giant, takes real steps to destabilize the American market, will Trump back down or continue to stick to his line, insisting on an unconditional victory? A colossal $1.8 trillion is at stake. That's the total trade turnover between the U.S. and Canada. Are both countries ready to risk such amounts by getting involved in a dangerous game? The outcome of the current tension is not yet clear. Perhaps, at the last moment, the parties will sit down at the negotiating table and find a compromise solution. However, so far the rhetoric sounds too harsh, and nothing indicates a willingness to compromise. Germany's anger is finding more and more supporters in Europe, and the issue of unilateral trade measures taken by the Trump administration remains extremely relevant. As this war of nerves in global trade intensifies, Germany seems to be becoming one of the key fronts of the confrontation. It remains only to observe the development of events in this large-scale struggle. It is quite possible that it is Berlin's firm position that will force Washington to reconsider its strategy and back down. Time will tell who will be stronger in this confrontation. If decisive measures are not taken, the current trade confrontation risks escalating into a full-scale conflict that will cause deep and possibly irreversible damage to the global economy. It remains only to observe the development of events and hope for the prudence of the parties. The future will show whether the world can avoid this dangerous abyss.